Welcome back to Brandon Wilborn's Fantasy Fiction Podcast, where fans of classic fantasy adventures can hear the serialized audiobooks of a fellow nerd and indie author completely for free. I'm your author, narrator, and host, Brandon Wilborn. Thanks for joining me this week. The story portion of this episode starts at about the minute and 45 mark if you want to skip me jabbering and get to me reading. Your choice. I really hope you guys are having a more normal week than I am. I am barely making my deadline this week to get this out because of just surprises. My little boy on the second day of school woke up in pain and the doctors thought that he had an appendicitis. So that was half a day. But fortunately, he's fine. And the odd thing is, I had the exact same experience at the exact same age, going to the hospital for what they thought was an appendicitis and then being fine after a little intervention. It's just odd that my son is having the exact same issues that I did at the same age. At the same time, there were some guys who were supposed to be coming to do some repairs on our house on Tuesday, but there was a scheduling mix-up, so now they're here Thursday, Friday, and I am cranking this out at the wee hours of the morning, trying to meet my deadline of Friday afternoon. So, there won't be a behind-the-keyboard segment or anything else afterwards, just the story today. Last week in The Treasure of Capric, Kurian faced the Siren song and almost lost. Captain Bacchus jumped overboard and Louise reappeared to save Kurian. This week I'll be reading Chapter 16. Now I present for your enjoyment The Treasure of Capric. Chapter 16. Hasslemere. The longboat swayed more heavily in the unprotected harbor than the cog they had just left. None of them had yet developed the sea legs necessary to stand in the smaller craft. The five of them sat on two benches, with Reese's large frame centered between Tobin and Louise. Kurian sat closer to the bow next to Noman, facing the others. Following closely behind was a second vessel carrying their horses ashore. Over the creaking and splashing made by the oars, Kurian heard the pilot of the trailing boat asking how they had come through the strait. The sailors of the Osprey answered as if the man were delusional. The rumor of their shortcut would travel quickly, and Mr. Darling was not as flamboyant or boastful as Captain Dilly had been. With Noman joining them, Tobin asked Louise to retell her story. "Since we'll land soon," she said, "I'll summarize." She took a deep breath and tucked some hair behind her ear before continuing. "As soon as we separated in the woods, Gideon moved us closer to the search parties. Our movements started to draw them towards us, but they weren't coming quickly enough for him. We heard Captain Fallon taunting you as we crept along. Gideon could tell that he was close to you four from the sound, so he readied us to create a distraction. It felt like we had gone about 100 yards deeper into the forest when Gideon shouted, and we all started running toward the cliffs, away from Dury. The soldiers took the bait and set off the first of Gideon's traps. I saw 3 of them chasing us with torches, and then something large flew past, and they were gone. The torches went out, and all I could hear was their screaming. The trap probably threw a whole tree at them, knowing Gideon. He stopped us from running much further, and we waited for the next opportunity. He'd placed several traps in the forest in case of trouble. I only hope he didn't leave any in place where an innocent person or some poor animal would trigger them." Noman waved his hand to urge her along. He was obviously not interested in the details. "The traps scared the soldiers, and they stopped following us. They probably saw it as proof the forest was haunted, but I think Gideon encourages those stories with his behavior. Soon enough, we heard the captain yelling at them, and Gideon got us ready to play bait again. This time I screamed, and we started moving." "We heard that scream," Reese said, "and He stopped when Tobin jabbed him in the ribs with an elbow. He looked at Tobin with an incredulous expression. "Well, we thought that was it for you, I guess." Louise looked down and hid a smile. "Well, I'm glad you didn't turn hero," she said. Kurian felt his face flush. He stuttered. You told us not to." "And then you magically escaped," Noman said impatiently. "When I screamed," she continued, "the captain started chasing us. We hadn't gone far when there was a blinding light and a boom like thunder. You heard it. You said it knocked you down?" It threw us on our faces, Tobin said. He looked excited. He had always loved the most adventurous stories from their order, the ones with unbelievable escapes. Kurian thought he looked like he was listening to one of them again, even though he had been part of this story. Fallon and his men were blown back and knocked out, but it didn't do anything like that to us, she continued. When the light had dimmed, the king was standing in front of us with a couple other men. He gave Gideon quite the look, but didn't say anything about the traps. He doesn't go for sneaky things like that. I don't care what you've heard. She held up a warning finger at Kurian, but he hadn't been planning to say anything this time. After that, it was simple. He set me on a horse and I headed for Whalesand. Alden and Gideon stayed with him. There were soldiers near the cottage, so I stayed away from there, or else I would have met you. I went straight through the plains instead of following the road, and I arrived yesterday morning, ahead of you. I watched you talking to Captain Bacchus, and after you left I waited to convince him to sneak me onto his ship. He wasn't in the best condition that night, but after a few hours of sleep I was able to wake him and find out your plans. When I heard that you were going to try the Straits, I convinced him that I could serve as an extra distraction against the Sirens. That work out how you expected? Asked Reese. I didn't anticipate that reaction, no, she said, looking embarrassed. But I'm glad I was there. She tilted an eyebrow at Kurian, who nodded agreement. I paid you back, he said. We can compare ledgers later, she shrugged. The rest of the story you know. We are glad you're unharmed, dear, Noman said, not looking at her. Kurian followed his gaze back to the Osprey. The Dean was still dealing with the events of the day. Kurian turned toward the quiet fishing town. A handful of buildings stood close to the water where a shallow quay led directly up to the main street. Fishing boats still moved around the bay, but no other large ships were there. Rama might attract the occasional shipment from afar, but in general it was a solitary place. It was the furthest southern town on the coast of the Northland Kingdoms, and had once been contested as an outpost of Pullingham. However, the town was indefensible, stuck on a narrow slice of land between the bay and Hasslemere, a large liver-shaped lake fed by the trickling runoff of the highlands to the east. It was a town similar to Appaford, in that there was nothing visible to outsiders that explained why people remained there to scratch out an existence. The strangest thing about the scene was the foreign architecture. The roof lines slanted more, and the doors and windows were set deep under large awnings. Instead of whitewash or colors made with clay, the town was almost colorless with dark browns, grays, and black. Only one large building close to the water stood out, painted a deep red color with large brass lamps hanging from the corners of the roof. Probably an establishment for the visiting sailors. When he considered the faded paint and the dilapidated condition of many of the buildings in contrast to this one, he found the overall impression of the town depressing. On landing, the oarsmen allowed them to disembark, tossed their baggage on the quay, and then pushed off to return to the Osprey. The ship's bow had already turned west to escape up the coast. Looks like Mr. Darling doesn't want to stop and chat with our pursuers, Kurian said, looking toward the blob of fog hovering on the water in the distance. He guessed they had a 3-hour head start before Fallon would be on their trail. After our interview with Captain Fallon, I don't blame him for running, Tobin said. Turning back toward Rama, Kurian found that the only bright point of the town was the youth and vitality of the people. Unlike Appaford, the people finishing their work for the day were younger and hardier, not people clinging to their final years. In contrast to those he saw in Pullingham and Downriver Town, they were working. They were clearly not wealthy, but they didn't appear dejected and slovenly like the people of his own country, and they were friendly enough to greet the strangers with a nod as they led their horses down the main street. It was a welcome feeling to be greeted, but when Kurian looked at the women, he couldn't help thinking of the Sirens. He smiled awkwardly and looked away. Merchants and traders quickly approached with shouts of, "Welcome, friends!" and "Excellent prices!" as they waved clothing, food, and various merchandise above the crowd. The accents were as varied as the goods. Kurian even heard an offer for their horses, and outrageous proposals from women near the Red Building. They wore audacious and revealing dresses that left little to the imagination. If Kurian and his friends were still wearing their robes, he doubted the women would have made the effort. The monks pushed through the cellars as politely as they could, following Louise straight through town toward the climbing hills and darkening clouds beyond. At the end of the street, less than a quarter-mile from the quay, the buildings abruptly stopped at the shore of the lake. There were no merchants or tradesmen at this end of town. The buildings at the water's edge were either storehouses or deserted shacks. The walls that faced the lake were windowless. In the afternoon light, the view was almost pleasant. Across the water, Kurian made out the far shore rising into wooded foothills. Above them, he knew the crags of the wild goats climbed to the top of the Northland cliffs. In the forefront, however, the water was black and still. It looked more like a bottomless hole than liquid, as if it might swallow anybody stepping foot into it. Dirty foam collected at the gravel shore, lapping at a slimy, moss-like vegetation that made walking treacherous. To their left, the lake expanded north, making the far shore invisible. 100 yards to their right, they saw 3 small fishing boats with triangular sails landing on the beach. Louise turned in their direction. 8 fishermen were hauling each boat ashore by the time they drew near. "Broadman!" Louise called, and a wiry but strong man left the group to meet them. The others continued to pull in the boats and cover them with tarps. He was shorter than Kurian, and certainly not the man they would have picked based on the name Broadman. He smiled when he saw Louise, revealing extremely white teeth behind several days of reddish-brown beard. "Hello, little turtle," he said to her. "Not hiding your head today, I see. What brings you to Rama?" He looked at the monks suspiciously. His glare made it hard to believe he would have taken their word that Louise sent them. "You already know I need to cross the lake, James. I'll hide once I'm on the other side." "And them?" James Broadman cocked his head toward her companions. "Don't look at me that way," he said to them. "I take after my mother's side." "They would come too." She handed something to him that Kurian couldn't see. "He wants to see them." Whatever she gave him seemed to satisfy his doubts about them. Perhaps it was payment, or some message from their leader. James only nodded, then looked back over the water and up at the clouds. "Can it wait until tomorrow?" Louise shook her head. "Hasslemere is not our friend tonight," James said. "If you can hide here, it will be safer, young turtle." "Enemies are close behind," Louise said. "The far side is the safest place." "I don't like it," said James, but whistled to the men working on his boat and gestured for them to launch it back into the water. "But if you must go, we cannot waste any time. Even now I'm not sure we can make it in time." "Have some faith," Louise whispered. James grunted. "I trust your king, but I believe in Hasslemere, at least more than any man's claims." He gave her a resigned shrug. "On the bright side, nobody can follow you until light." "Why not?" Tobin asked. Something about the situation had turned him pale. "Nobody sails Hasslemere after dark," James answered, "and this storm makes it doubly dangerous." Then he pointed at the horses. "They'll have to stay. I don't have space for them, and you don't have time to carry a larger boat from the quays. Sentries on the other side might be able to help you with new ones." Without waiting for discussion, he turned to his fellows and spoke hastily while Kurian and his friends pulled the packs from their horses and handed them to the 2 men waiting in the boat. Next, they struggled to pull themselves through the single gap in the high, scalloped gunwales. James followed quickly and climbed nimbly into the boat with perfect balance. As soon as he was on board, he covered the gap with a shield-like plank. When Kurian saw this, he realized that the railing was not truly scalloped, but that the whole boat was surrounded with removable, eye-shaped planks. Each fit into an iron catch and had a handle facing inward. Other than permitting entry to the boat, he could not tell what purpose they served. Benches crossed the hull, like in the longboat, except that box frames covered in netting were stowed beneath them. The passengers sat down facing the bow, and James stood directly in the front. With the 2 fishers who sat in back with oars, they filled the craft. "Now, boys, this is Seamus, and that's Tully," James said, pointing to the other fishermen who began rowing away from the shore. "You do anything they say and we'll be fine." Louise and the Caprics nodded. "Hasslemere's an unusual lake. How can I explain it?" He rubbed his chin and looked up, thinking. "It's not haunted, per se, but there is a knack to crossing safely, especially under conditions like these." His words did not encourage Kurian. Tobin raised a hand as if he were in the dean's class. The hand trembled slightly. Why exactly don't you sail at night? Because you can't see the hasslefish, James answered flatly. That's what I thought you'd say. Tobin was sweating in the cool air. What's a hasslefish? Kurian asked. Scuttle me, James muttered. I shouldn't have said anything. Listen, we have enough light to see them coming. Just do what we say if we come across them, and we'll make it. I've dealt with them a dozen times. Of course we do better to avoid them altogether. James did not gesture in excess while he talked, but his frustration at his passengers was clear. As I was saying, Hasslemere's tricky, even in daylight. It senses your moods, and it tries to make you lose your bearings. I thought you said it wasn't haunted, Tobin said, his voice cracking. Per se, James added. Tobin nodded manically. It's not haunted in the normal sense, James struggled to explain. It just has a personality. I don't know how it works. I only know what it does to people who head out unprepared. If everybody on board isn't completely certain about their destination, fogs and storms brew up out of nowhere. If somebody's in a foul mood, we don't let them sail because the lake turns foul. And that's when the hasslefish hunt. Sounds more like silly superstition to me, Noman grumbled. At least, that's what I would have thought this morning. He looked up for the first time since they had left the Osprey, and his face had changed. Kurian thought he looked less certain of himself. The dean, who had always known everything, was beginning to doubt his convictions. Kurian knew it had started with the witch at Finn. Noman had to rebuild his whole world after that revelation. Now, after being wrong about the Sirens, the truth of the world around him had shaken him to his core. Kurian liked the change. He looked humbled, and that made him look kinder. Now, James said loudly, and pulled a hand down his face. Maybe we can quit the interruptions and avoid dying today, yes? Good. He took a deep breath and composed himself. If we sail and row, we'll shave off some time and reach the far shore in about an hour. Look at that gap in the trees, he said, turning and pointing over the bow. See where the shoreline is visible and clear. That is where we're going. When we get closer, you'll see two markers that will make it easier to see. Focus on that point. Know that's where we're going, but just as importantly, believe that we can get there. Any seed of doubt or distraction in your mind will only agitate the lake, and then it will try to befuddle us. Does everyone understand? He waited for them to show that they did. Focus and believe. We get across easy. After James's speech, Tobin and Noman began praying immediately, along the same lines as his instructions. They asked for focus and confidence in their arrival, as well as protection from God. Reese leaned forward on his bench, propping an arm against the removable planks and staring hard at their destination. He had never excelled at performing multiple tasks, so singular concentration was his best chance of success. Louise also stared toward the landing site, but her gaze wandered toward the hills above with a satisfied and expectant smile. Kurian couldn't join in prayer with Tobin and the dean. His mind never wandered as much as it did during prayer. For 15 minutes he tried Reese's method of staring at their goal, but his mind raced with unanswered questions, predictions of their immediate future, and memories of the last month's horrors. Even as he looked at the far-off beach, his mind jumped hundreds of miles away in a second. The water of the lake was still, except for the wrinkled chevron in their wake. Only the fluttering of the sail and the rhythmic dipping of the oars broke the silence. With each stroke they groaned with protest in their slots, as if the boat itself did not want to continue the journey. Between light puffs of breeze from the ocean, the smell of coming rain poured down from the hills with the resinous scent of evergreens and juniper. The combination was a somber song from a lonely boat in a more solemn landscape. At the same time, the accumulated weariness of traveling throbbed behind Kurian's eyes and made concentration difficult. He tried to shake himself into wakefulness, and finally decided that he needed to talk to somebody. With the others trying to focus in their own ways, James looked like the safest choice. He slid between the two rowing fishermen to where James had moved to take the tiller at the stern. Why do you call Louise Turtle? He asked. When I met her, James answered. She was cowering inside a hood, trying to hide her head like a turtle. Kurian nodded, not sure he understood the motivation for the nickname, and decided to change the subject. With all the danger, he said, why do you sail this lake? Don't get distracted, James warned. I won't, Kurian said. Talking a little will keep my mind from wandering too much. James nodded. We're on the lake because it's lucrative. Not ferrying people for the king so much, he said, nodding toward Louise, but the everyday work. What would that be? Crabbing, James said. Those boxes under the seats are crab traps. The noble women up north pay handsomely for a powder made from the shells of crabs found only in this lake. The meat's worthless except for feeding pigs, but we grind the shells and mix them with oils. When the mixture is cooked, it turns a deep red color, and they paint their faces with it in King Bagler's court. You still haven't told us what a hasslefish is, Kurian said, trying to get his original question answered. They're a small fish, usually no more than 10 inches. James held up his index fingers to indicate the length. Ugly things. Teeth pointing out in every direction. Why would you be worried about a little fish? Because they hunt in packs, James said quietly, keeping his eyes on the far shore. Usually over 50 of them come together near the surface. When the lake turns foul and it's difficult to get your bearings, the brutes leap out of the water. Some of them fly over the boat. They also have a row of spines on either side like a porcupine. Once they're in the air, they throw them like little poisoned needles. The men who are hit go mad, usually fling themselves into the water and become lunch. Those shields along the gunwale are good protection if we need them. Kurian sighed heavily. Sirens, storms, poisoned fish? Why does anybody ever get into a boat? It wasn't always this way, James said incredulously. Story goes a witch cursed the lake when her children got lost in a fog and drowned. He began to sing. A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children because they are no more. At least that's what the songs say. The water has been calm ever since, only disturbed by the strongest storms and something breaking the surface. It took on her animosity and pain then, and the hasslefish started to appear. A curse. One more reason to stay off it. Wait, what are you doing? Kurian's anxiety about the boat sharpened as James turned away from their destination. More surprising, the sail and its heavy wooden boom shot across the boat, over the heads of the 2 men rowing, nearly catching Kurian in the stomach. I'm only jibing, James said calmly. But I thought we were heading for the gap in the trees. Yes, but we go faster if we zigzag a bit, to better catch the wind. James looked at Kurian and laughed at his shocked expression. You should sit down and try to focus, before I give you a nickname. In 5 minutes we should be able to see the pillars marking the trail, and then it would be easier. Kurian nodded and gingerly stepped back to his seat beside Noman. While his curiosity was sated, apprehension about the dangers of the lake gnawed at his mind. He truly hoped they had a safe journey, but a cloud of fear hung over him with the idea of fending off the darts of the hasslefish. Was his stubborn insistence on retrieving the treasure going to kill them all in the end? Even though they had survived this far, others had paid the ultimate price, and he and his friends had killed for it. Could this really be what God wanted for them, despite their oaths? He looked up between the shields when the boat turned again, and had trouble finding the beach. The light was fading surprisingly fast now, and the shore looked farther away, not closer. The markers should be visible, according to James, but they weren't there. Even the lighter-colored beach was harder to see when he found it. It was like looking through old glass. Everybody needs to check their minds and hearts, James called from the stern, caution in his voice. There's a mist gathering, but we're almost there. He pointed to the shore. Remember, we're going there. Look at the fires on the pillars. The mention of a fog confirmed Kurian's fear that they might be sailing into trouble. He couldn't see the pillars or the fires, and this worried him even more. The fog thickened, and darkness settled at the edge of his vision. Slowly, the darkness closed in so that the beach was the only thing visible, and it was shrinking as if he were traveling down a long tunnel. Everything outside the confines of the boat was dissolving from his vision. Disturbance, James said. Port side. They all looked where he pointed and saw several ripples spreading across the surface 100 yards away. A soft bubbling sound like many oars dipping into the water moved toward the boat. "Take 2 shields," James told them, grabbing 2 of the planks himself. "Protect your side and your front. The person next to you will cover your other side. Press the 2 shields together above you." He tied the tiller to the rail so the boat would stay on course, and then pointed once more at the beach. "Above all, remember that beach and we'll make it. Shields up and ignore the chaos. Remember the beach." James kneeled behind Seamus and Tully on their bench. They pulled up the oars and grabbed their own shields. Between the 3 of them, they formed a cone shape with the planks that covered them on all sides and overlapped on top. Tobin saw their formation and copied it with Rhys and Louise. Kurian and Noman did their best, sitting back to back and holding up 4 shields. The planks were heavy and difficult to hold in position, and hiding in the dark shell made it even more challenging to think of the beach. Everything was still for almost a minute. Huddled in the small shelter with Noman, the echoing staccato of their breathing took Kurian to the verge of panic. The silence outside dragged on until he was tempted to lower his shield and peek out. Suddenly, something struck his right shield with a thump. In a moment, 3 more strikes hit together. He heard the projectiles hitting elsewhere on the boat, but most landed on his shield as far as he could tell. "It's Kurian!" James yelled. "For all our sakes, knock him out!" The order surprised him, and he looked over his shoulder at the dean. Noman looked surprised, too, and didn't look like he intended to follow it. "I'm serious!" James yelled. "If I'm drawing them," Kurian said to the dean, but he looked back with a pained look. "Rhys," Noman called. "You can reach him easier. You do it." They shuffled around to regroup while the spines thudded into the shields and the ship. Before they had all their shields propped up, one of the fish landed in the bottom of the boat at Kurian's feet. In an instant he saw the dull gray scales of the fish, the sharp ridge along its back, and the riot of pointed teeth in its mouth. It looked at him with eyes like jet. Then the fish flopped against the deck, and the quills on its side shot up like arrows. Kurian felt them pierce his chest and arm, and he fell between the 2 benches. Other than the immediate pain on impact, he didn't cry out, and he didn't feel anything but shock. Louise screamed, but Noman and Rhys immediately closed the circle of shields to cover Kurian between them. "James!" Tobin yelled. "They hit Kurian." "Put him out now, or he's dead!" James roared. Rhys lifted his fist and grimaced, then slammed it down on Kurian's forehead. The back of his head smacked against the hull, and everything went black. After surviving the Sirens, what will the hasslefish do to Kurian? Join me next Friday as the treasure of Capric continues. I really wish I had time to add a behind-the-keyboard segment about the hasslefish, because they fascinate me, even though they're from my own imagination. But it's all I can do this week just to get the main episode out, because hassles. Funny how things like that work out sometimes. I actually had the privilege of guest preaching a couple of weeks ago, and my topic was finding peace from God in the midst of overwhelming chaos, and everything outside the church that day was chaotic. The fire alarm went off in the hotel at 6 a.m., I lost my wallet for a little while, and then we got stuck in a traffic jam, so we had to take dirt forest roads back home. That meant I missed the meeting I was supposed to be at for our own church. Sometimes you give a message or you tell somebody something that you feel like is a godly idea, and it seems like either the enemy is trying to prove you're a liar by making you a hypocrite, or the Lord is testing how much you actually believe that sermon. Anyway, if you want to hear more from me, I usually send out an email newsletter about twice a month. You can always sign up for those email updates on my website, brandonwilborn.com. And when you do, I'll send you a free story about the exciting origins of the Capric monks during the days of Finn. It's called The Relic. And it's an action-packed little read you can kind of breeze through in an hour or so. On the other hand, I would love to hear from you if you have questions or comments. Usually about the story or the podcast itself. I actually received a wonderful message this week from somebody who went to my contact page. And you can do the same. You can leave me a voicemail or type it out in the contact box by going to brandonwilborn.com/contact. Thanks again for listening to the show. If you're enjoying it, please give it a 5-star rating and review. And if those options are in your podcast app, it should be quick and easy. Then think of 1 or 2 people you know who always have their face in a fantasy book and share the show with them to see if they might enjoy it too. That's all for this week. Thanks again. Until next time, Godspeed. The Treasure of Capric is also available in print and ebook formats from all major booksellers. Find a link to your favorite retailer in the show description or go to brandonwilborn.com. That's brand on, not brand off, and Wilborn is as simple as you can make it. Wilborn. This has been The Treasure of Capric, Book 1 of The King of the Caves, written and narrated by Brandon M. Wilborn. Copyright Brandon M. Wilborn.